You won't recognize that moment with your mind. It doesn't come like a bang or a shock. It comes like a breath-subtle, almost unnameable whispering that something deep within you has started to shift. A woman can live her whole life in a mold behind a smile, playing the roles society has handed her. Until one day, she hears a call in the silence, a call no one else can hear from the shadows of her own soul. That's when the quiet revolution begins. Not every collapse is the end. Some breakdowns open the first door back to yourself. The awakening of a woman is never a straight path. It begins with a truth she can no longer deny. Maybe it's a breakup, a betrayal, a death, or simply an unshakable exhaustion no one understands. And then she just can't pretend anymore. She starts withdrawing from conversations that feel fake, from relationships that make her small. She no longer wants to please. She stops trying to be reasonable. She starts listening to her body, the ache in her belly, the sleepless nights, the whispers in her dreams. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like the world you live in is no longer enough to hold you, like you're longing for a part of yourself you've never even met? Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of returning to the wholeness you truly are. But to walk that path, you must step into the dark. Face the parts of yourself you've hidden. Hear the repressed cries, the stifled rage, the desires once labeled wrong. But this isn't a call to suffering. It's an invitation to truth. Because only when you dare to face the shadow can the light begin to rise. So what really happens inside a woman when she begins the journey back to herself? How does a wound, especially a wound of the feminine, become the very starting point of soul liberation? Let's step into the next part together, where darkness is no longer something to fear, but the very place where the soul begins to bloom. There is a moment in a woman's life when the mirrors she once trusted begin to distort. What once reflected beauty, acceptance, and control now shows something else, cracks questions and ghosts. And in that haunting quiet, she begins to feel the weight of all that she has abandoned within herself. To return to oneself is not a poetic idea. It is a descent, a shedding, and often a rupture. Carl Jung taught us that the psyche is not linear. It is not a straight path from pain to healing. It is circular, labyrinthine, symbolic. And for the woman who begins to awaken from the long sleep of adaptation to societal roles, family expectations, relational compromises, the first figure she meets is not the divine within her, but the darkness she has long buried, the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not your enemy. It is simply everything you have not been allowed to express. Every too much, every not enough. Every scream swallowed, every dream deferred, every boundary crossed in silence. The shadow is not outside you. It is you. And that is why it terrifies. Most women are taught from a young age that goodness equals silence, that love means tolerance, that beauty requires disconnection from one's own needs. And so the feminine psyche fragments, the body goes one way, the heart another, and the soul is left somewhere far behind, exiled and waiting. But when the awakening begins, all the old strategies fail. She can no longer override her intuition. Her body begins to ache in places where trauma has long been stored. She cannot continue small-talking her way through relationships that feel empty. She starts to notice how often she apologizes for simply existing. This stage is sacred and terrifying. This is the negro, the blackening, the first alchemical stage of transformation. Here, the old self begins to decompose, not because it was bad, but because it was incomplete. Because it was only ever a mask, a container, and the soul cannot be contained once it has heard its own name. What does it look like, this confrontation with the shadow? Sometimes it's anger, raw, volcanic, unapologetic. The kind of rage that isn't violent, but ancestral. Rage that says, I will no longer carry what does not belong to me. Other times, it's grief. A grief so deep it cannot be described because it's not about one loss, but every loss of innocence, of voice, of self-trust. And then there are memories. Moments from the past that resurface not because they are new, but because for the first time she is strong enough to see them without looking away. The time she was touched without consent. The years she spent performing happiness. The dreams she silenced to keep a relationship alive. These fragments surface not to destroy her, but to offer her a choice. Will you finally see me? Will you welcome me back? Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the true beginning. Not the books, not the affirmations, not the rituals, but this standing in front of your own discarded self and choosing not to turn away. Let's take an example. Elena. Not her real name, was a 38-year-old woman who had done everything right. Successful career, 2 kids, a partner who looked perfect on paper. But inside, she felt like a ghost. She came to therapy not knowing what she needed, just that she was so tired. Within weeks, her dreams turned vivid caves, bleeding trees, serpents wrapping around her arms. She wept without knowing why. Her body began trembling during yoga. One night she screamed into a pillow until her voice broke. She wasn't breaking down. She was breaking open. What Elena met was her shadow, 20 years of sexual shame, unresolved postpartum rage, and the deep abandonment of her creative fire. And though it terrified her at first, she began writing poetry again, dancing alone in her kitchen, saying no without guilt, crying in front of her children without apology. She didn't become someone else. She reclaimed who she had always been. This is what it means to return to yourself, to let the pain you've hidden become the teacher, to let the body you've rejected become the temple, to let your emotions, especially the forbidden ones, guide you like torches through the inner forest. But this isn't a solitary journey. It feels solitary, yes, but it was never meant to be walked alone. That's why it's so vital to speak these truths aloud, to connect with others, other women, other seekers who are walking their own paths of remembering. When we share our stories, we create a net of soul. We remind each other that the descent is not failure, it is initiation. So if you find yourself in this place, this shadow terrain, know this: you are not broken. You are becoming whole. What hurts now is not the wound, but the part of you trying to heal. Now, I want to invite you, if this resonates, if you felt these shifts in your own life, leave a comment. Not to explain, not to impress. Just a word, a moment, a truth. Let's build this space together, a space where the shadow is not banished, but welcomed as sacred, because the next part of this journey, where we're heading next, is even more profound. If confronting the shadow is the first threshold, then reclaiming the wounded feminine, especially the sexual wound passed down through generations, is the sacred fire that transforms the soul. And that's exactly where we'll go in the next part. We'll explore how your body remembers what your mind has forgotten, and how healing the feminine wound is not just personal, it's ancestral, it's collective, and it's revolutionary. Because the awakening of one woman is never just hers alone. No one teaches a woman how to live in her body like it's a sacred temple. She's taught how to please, how to behave, how to be appropriate. But no one tells her that life itself, creative energy, sexuality, soulies her true home. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And for women, that path often begins at the deepest wound, the wound of the wounded feminine. It's not just a physical wound. It's symbolic, psychological, collective, formed over generations of women taught to shrink, to stay silent, to obey, just to be called good. In today's world unruled by imbalanced masculine energy, the feminine isn't erased. Worse, it's distorted. You're admired if you're sexy, but only if you're well-behaved. You're free as long as you're not too powerful, not too emotional. You're allowed to be a mother, a wife, a lover, but who asks, "Who are you?" when it's just you. This is unconscious fragmentation, where a woman is forced to choose between sexuality and soul, between desire and decency, between freedom and safety. And it's at that point of fracture that the wound is born. It lives in your cells, in the memories you've never spoken, in your bloodline. It's your grandmother's story of a woman who stayed silent her entire life. It's the recurring dream where you're being chased by a version of yourself. That wound carries the shadow of Lilith, the woman cast out of Eden for refusing to submit. It breathes with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, twisted into a symbol of shameful desire. We don't just need healing, we need resurrection. A remembering of the sacred feminine archetypes that were distorted in our collective psyche. You begin to sense it when you feel disconnected from your own body. You avoid true intimacy because it feels like losing yourself. You judge your own desire like it's something shameful. You seek love as if asking for permission to exist. And that is where the healing begins. You stop trying to be the perfect version. You start seeing your body with reverence. You say yes to pleasure, not to please someone else, but to reconnect with yourself. You no longer divide yourself. This part is soul, that part is flesh. Because you finally understand your soul lives in your body. It's not separate from it. Healing isn't about going back to who you were. It's about becoming who you were before the world told you you weren't enough. And on this path, yes, you will feel alone. Because when you begin to love yourself in both your light and your shadow, your sensuality and your sacredness, the old world no longer fits. Some people will leave, some roles will fall apart, but in their place, you'll begin attracting others who are also remembering themselves. You'll find community, not through rules, but through deep soul recognition. If these words speak to you, leave a comment. Even just an emoji, a word, an unnamed acheites, a thread of connection. Because no one should have to heal alone. Because your wound, once shared, becomes a light for someone else. We don't need more advice. We need space to remember. And in the next part, we'll go even deeper. What happens when a woman begins to radiate from within? When she no longer asks for permission to exist, but walks as a living myth? And then, what happens to the world around her? The answer lies in the next chapter. When a woman is reborn, the world begins to tremble. There is something few will tell you at the start of your journey back to your self-solitude. Not solitude in the absence of others, but a deep, sacred kind of aloneness, the kind that arrives when you stand in the center of your life with no more roles left to perform. Carl Jung wrote, "The process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, always involves a temporary withdrawal from social life. For one must leave the stage of the false self in order to meet the soul. When a woman begins to speak the truth, live in authenticity, and love herself as a sacred being, her relationships will inevitably be tested. The once gentle friend now grows reactive. The silent mother begins to question. the subtly controlling partner, feels threatened. And the familiar world, where she once diminished herself to be loved, no longer feels like home. This is not because she has become difficult or selfish, but because she has ceased to build her nest in patterns that no longer align with her becoming. She enters the archetype of the spiritual wanderer, no longer belonging to any single place, no longer seeking approval from external structures. Like the wild woman in Women Who Run with the Wolves, she begins to hear the call of the forest, the voice of the wild soul long buried under centuries of domestication. She begins to remember the dreams of childhood long suppressed, the rage once silenced, the desires once taught to be shameful. And in that remembering she feels estranged. Those once called family no longer understand her. The conversations that once brought joy now echo hollow. She longs for connection, but cannot bear the false. She longs to love, but will no longer shrink to be received. Jung did not speak of darkness to instill fear, but to illuminate its role as threshold. And this solitude, the profound solitude you feel, is evidence that you have crossed the first threshold of individuation. You no longer live to appease. You begin to dwell in yourself without performance. You begin to discern between your true pain and the inherited wounds of generations past. This is a rebirth, a quiet one, unadorned, unseen. There is no crown, no applause. Only you standing in the desert of the psyche, held by a silence vast enough to hear your soul. For in isolation, the soul begins to speak, and you discover the most essential gift, the capacity to be with yourself. You stop seeking meaning in others' reflections. You cease the pursuit of false security, and you begin the creation of a new psychic reality, one where you define who you are. This is the turning point, where you are no longer the victim of fate, but the author of your own myth. If you find yourself here, between two worlds, between the old that has dissolved and the new yet to arrive, know that you are not alone. Leave something in the space below. A question, a dream, a feeling without a name. Together, we are building a sanctuary of soul without judgment, without solutions, just presence. We do not need quick fixes. We need the quiet courage to look at our own shadow and not turn away. In the next chapter, we will descend into one of the most challenging aspects of the journey. What happens when a woman touches her inner light and the man cannot hold it? For not everyone is ready to love a woman who has awakened, and his withdrawal, his unspoken absence, may wound more than any goodbye. But it does not reflect your worth. It reveals only his fear of the light you now carry. Let us enter that shadowed terrain together in the next part, when a man cannot love an awakened woman. There exists an unspoken truth. Not every man is capable of holding the light of a woman who has undergone the process of awakening. It is not because he is unworthy. It is not because he does not feel love. It is because he has never learned to remain in a love he cannot control. When a woman enters love with conscious awareness, not to be completed, but to share her wholeness, it disrupts the psychological balance of many men. She does not seek rescue. She does not play the victim. She does not remain silent to keep the peace. She does not accept partial truths or conditional affection. Instead, she arrives as a mirror reflecting every layer of suppressed emotion, every trace of inauthenticity, and every childlike part the man has yet to integrate. And that evokes fear. He may have once been passionate, engaged, intense, desiring. But as the relationship deepens, when the woman begins to truly see him beyond the persona, he begins to withdraw. There is no dramatic ending. No betrayal, only distance, coolness, ambiguity. The woman then begins to question, did I do something wrong? Was any of it ever real? Yet from a Jungian perspective, the answer lies within the shadow. When love touches the unhealed psyche, the mask must fall. And that is the moment the man panics not from lack of feeling, but from the loss of control over those feelings. An awakened woman does not love unconsciously. She loves through presence depth and the ability to perceive the soul. Her love requires no tactics, no performance, no certainty, only authenticity. And this very essence activates a deep inner conflict in many men. He loves, but fears being truly seen. He longs to be close, but fears dissolution of self. He does not know how to open without equating it with weakness. And so he chooses what feels safe, disappearing into silence. She may hurt deeply. She may weep in long nights of solitude, but she no longer collapses, because now she understands love is not something to be earned or negotiated. She knows if someone cannot hold her light, it is not her failure. She may grieve, but she does not shrink. She may remember, but she does not lose herself. She may still love, but never at the expense of dimming her radiance. In Jungian psychology, true union is only possible when the anima within the man is awakened, when he no longer sees woman as object, but as an equal soul to encounter. This demands of him to confront the wound of the mother, to release the archetype of the isolated, invulnerable man, to allow himself to be seen fully, imperfectly, authentically. Only then can he return to love not as ego play, but as a sacred act of the psyche. Have you ever loved such a man, one who was once close, then vanished, one who made promises, then fell silent, one who once saw you only to leave you in darkness? If so, you are invited to share, not to blame, but to connect. For this pain is not merely personal, it is collective. It is the wound of countless women learning to love without abandoning the self. In the next part, we shall explore a subtle yet powerful truth. What happens when a man cannot speak, but his body reveals everything? As Jung once wrote, the unconscious does not appear only in dreams, it manifests in gestures, in gaze, in breath. So if he does not say, "I love you," but remains in presence through the smallest of acts, can you learn to trust the language of the soul beyond the logic of the spoken word? Join me in the next chapter, when the body speaks what the heart cannot yet admit. Love does not always arrive as words. There are moments when language fails, blocked by fear, by wounds, by chapters that remain unfinished. But the body does not lie. Carl Jung once wrote, "A living symbol is not a lifeless idea, but an image in motion connecting the conscious and unconscious into a stream of life." So when a man cannot say, "I love you," but his eyes search for you in a crowded room, his hand finds the small of your back when no one is looking, his voice softens when you are in pain, it is the unconscious speaking. Gesture, posture, distance, glance. These are all expressions of the primordial language, the language we used long before we learned how to speak. Think back to childhood. You knew who loved you, not through their words, but through the gaze that followed, the arms that held tight, the hand that reached out just before you fell. So when a man cannot name his emotions, observe his body. Does he lean subtly in your direction? When you brush his hand, does he hold still? When you hurt, does he stay in silence? Present. This is not coincidence. These are living symbols, as Jung described, where the unconscious becomes visible in form, gesture, and movement. And here, the soul begins to whisper. If you've ever watched animals, you'll see they do not declare love in language. They say, "I love you" through eyes, tails, nuzzles, and nearness. Love in its most primal state needs no explanation. It is felt through bodies, through rhythm, through presence. Modern man within his civilized ego often forgets She too is a creature. We possess body memory, a deep repository of every touch, abandonment, and moment of love. This is why, even when a man says, "I don't know how to express feelings," his body may still speak for him out of instinct, not strategy. Jung wrote that a living symbol is a bridge between the inner and outer world. It is not meant to be understood with the mind alone, but felt. So notice the quiet look when you turn away, the deep inhale when old pain arises, the bowed head when you cry. These are not meaningless reactions. They are symbolic acts where the unconscious stirs even if no words exist yet. Jung believed the soul speaks in images and behavior gesture presence. These are the most vivid images of all. They do not need logic. They need a heart that perceives. Observe the space between you. Does the distance close in silence? Does he respond to your body's rhythm? Do his eyes linger longer than they should? Pay attention to the unspoken, the subtle touches, the seemingly casual questions, the text that just happened to arrive when you felt sad. You are witnessing a soul learning to love, not with words, but with presence. Have you ever heard love in silence? Seen it in someone's eyes? If so, share a moment below. A quiet fragment, a wordless truth. Not everyone is fluent in expression, but the soul always speaks. Together we are creating a space where emotion is honored, where no one must shout to be heard. But even when the body speaks of love, even when the soul whispers through glances, touches, and stillness, what happens when that love touches an unhealed wound? In the next chapter, we will enter one of the most painful and transformative stages, when love awakens the fear of abandonment, and the man retreats, not because he no longer loves, but because he is afraid. Can you witness this darkness without blaming yourself? Can you remain with yourself, even if he no longer remains with you? Let us walk forward into part 6. When love awakens the shadow and his withdrawal is the cry of a wound. When a man loves you deeply, what you may encounter is not always closeness. Sometimes what you meet is distance. You feel him grow quiet, faint, cold. There's no clear reason, no argument, no farewell, only a strange silence where warmth used to dwell. And you ask yourself, what did I do wrong? The truth is, you did nothing wrong. You simply got too close, too deep, and your love touched a place within him he's never dared to enter his own shadow. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Love, when it ceases to be a game or surface, passion becomes a rite of passage. It awakens forgotten memories, childhood fears, and ancient wounds the man has learned to bury rather than heal. When a man suddenly withdraws, many women misinterpret it as abandonment. But often it is defense. He is not running from you. He is running from the parts of himself your love has awakened. Because in his unconscious love, pain, love, vulnerability, love, loss, shame, and weakness. So when he begins to truly love you, his soul begins to tremble. He feels out of control of his emotions, his need for you, his sense of safety. And in that fear, his nervous system does the only thing it knows, retreat. Jung called this the shadow, the dark side of the soul filled with shame, buried hurt, and exiled instincts. Loving you forces him to feel I'm not worthy. I might get hurt. I'm not enough. I'm losing control. And perhaps the most terrifying, you could hurt me because I love you for real. In this space, a man might choose to walk away even as his heart stays behind. This is the paradox of the shadow withdrawal. Does not mean the absence of love. It means the inability to contain it. And here you have two choices. You can chase after him trying to prove your lover, isking your own center in the chaos of his wounds. Or you can return to yourself and chord soft, yet sovereign, refusing to shrink or beg for connection. The hardest part, to see his retreat not as personal rejection, but as the pain signal of a wounded nervous system. You cannot love on someone's behalf, but you can stand in presence with clarity and compassion, letting your soul be a safe ground. Have you ever experienced this? When the man you loved became distant and you didn't know why? Share your story below, not to judge, but to heal together. This is a space where you are heard, a space where hearts that love deeply recognize one another. But the story doesn't end here, because sometimes after the retreat comes the return, not as before, not in fantasy, but in truth, from a man who no longer fights against himself. In the next chapter, we will explore the beginning of reconciliation, when he returns, not because you chased him, but because he saw himself through the mirror of your love. Join me in the final part, when the man stops running and chooses to stay with his whole heart. There are journeys that can never be mapped. No one tells you that when you love deeply, you will come face to face with the parts of yourself and the other that have never been healed. No one prepares you for the truth that love is not just about connection. It is also about unraveling. It is the subtle quake of the soul when someone begins to see themselves through your eyes. Carl Jung once wrote, "He who does not see his own shadow casts it upon another." And that is what deep love does. It places a mirror before you, not to judge, but to reveal what is within both light and shadow. A man chooses to stay not because you held on, but because he has passed through the fear and discovered that love does not make him less, it makes him more of who he truly is. And you, the woman who bravely held your light, not trying to fix, not trying to control, simply present with a clear, grounded heart. You did something miraculous. You gave love a space to grow in freedom. We live in a world that teaches us to hold on to love. But deep love, the kind Jung called transformational, cannot be possessed. It can only be understood. And sometimes, to love rightly, you must let the other walk into themselves first. Only when they meet their own essence can love be a meeting point, not a place of escape. So if you've ever loved someone, and they disappeared just as the connection deepened, don't rush to the conclusion that you weren't enough. It's possible you touched a part of them they weren't yet ready to see, and that is not failure. That is the gateway to truth. Have you ever experienced something like this? Love came close, then quietly left. Share your story in the comments. No story is too small. No feeling is wrong. Because here, in this community of souls learning to love with depth, we create space for truth to be spoken. If this message makes you feel seen, if something in you stirred, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes of Love and the Shadow, where we explore love through the lens of deep psychology. Remember, you are not alone. What you feel is real. What you carry is sacred. And this is all part of your awakening. In a world that moves fast, true love is a return, not to become someone, but to remember who you were before you forgot. And if someone once left, then returned with a trembling but honest heart, know this: you were the one who illuminated their shadow. I'll see you in the next episode, where heart and unconscious reconnect, and where love is no fairy tale, but a path into light.